In 1953, after researching in his University of Pittsburgh laboratory, Jonas Salk released his inactive polio vaccine. While researching his polio vaccine, he exchanged ideas with his mentor, Dr. Francis Jr., encountered criticism from the scientific community for his work, and explored the new type of vaccine. 165 people contracted polio a day. The population with polio was rising even faster than the population in the height of the baby boom. His vaccine helped eradicate polio around the world, and is being used in America because it is safer than the oral vaccine. His vaccine is helping put an end to the disease that once terrorized the world. If not for his vaccine, vaccines such as hepatitis A, hepatitis B, and rabies would not have existed.
Poliomyelitis, otherwise known as polio, is a highly infectious disease caused by a virus that lives in the throat and intestinal tract that invades the nervous system. It is most often spread through person-to-person contacts with stool of an infected person, and may also spread through the oral and nasal secretions, such as saliva. Less than 1% of polio cases resulted in permanent paralysis of the limbs, usually just the legs. Of those paralyzed, 5 to 10% die when paralysis strikes the respiratory muscles. Paralysis can lead to permanent disabilities and death. It first enters through your mouth and then enters the bloodstream, causing nausea, headaches, fevers, muscle and back pain or stiffness. In 99% of cases, it goes no farther, but in the other 1% of cases, it re-enters the bloodstream and it attacks the nervous system. Depending on where it attacks, depends on how severely you are affected. If it enters in the lower back, you are paralyzed in your legs, in the lower neck, and you are paralyzed in all 4 limbs. And if it enters in the base of your brain or spinal cord, you would most likely die.
His laboratory at the Salk Institute in Hoya, back here in La Jolla, California. And so I got to see him up close in the laboratory and with the work that he was doing. And his attitude always was that when you're doing an experiment, you're asking a question of nature, and nature's going to give you the answer. Mm-hmm. So the phrase he used was that the answer pre-exists. What we have to do is to figure out what are the right questions to ask.
Jonas Salk was born in 1914, and starting in 1910, polio outbreaks became common in the developed world. When Jonas Salk was a kid, his mom, Dora Salk, wouldn't let him go outside because polio was rampaging, especially around the slums that Jonas Salk was born in. Jonas Salk was held to high academic standards, which led him to study in the medicine at New York City College. He studied under his professor, Francis Jr., in which he got interested in virology and epidemiology, which would later become his passion.
Before Salk defended the world against polio with his groundbreaking vaccine, he was commissioned by the U.S. government to help Dr. Francis Jr. create a vaccine to immunize the United States military fighting in Europe and Japan against influenza. He and Francis developed a theory, the inactive viral vaccine. They tested this vaccine in a mass clinical trials in prison psychiatric wards. Jonas Salk and Dr. Francis learned that there were many strains of the flu virus. They also figured out a way to predict what strain would strike. Later in his career, after the success of the influenza vaccine, which would lead to being recruited by the March of Dimes Foundation to work on the polio vaccine, there were also 3 strains of the poliomyelitis virus. So work with influenza made it easier for him to deal with that threat.
After working with Dr. Francis in Michigan on the influenza vaccine, he moved to the University of Pittsburgh. He was planning to continue research influenza virus on his own, but the March of Dimes Foundation, which was created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, recruited him to find a vaccine for the polio virus. He was recruited in 1947 and would spend the next 6 years working on the vaccine for this deadly virus. He was given free control over the laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh. He was funded to do all his work mostly through the March of Dimes Foundation. There were other researchers at the time working on the polio vaccine for much longer than he was, but they were trying to understand how the virus worked and not trying to cure it as fast as possible. In 1953, he started his human trial. He started on children who had had polio already. and he was just going to measure their antibody levels.
There were 3 strains of the virus, and each of the children had one of them. Jonas Salk made a vaccine for each strain of the virus and administered the vaccine to the children as they had already had. So, if they were to catch the virus from the vaccine, there would be no further damage to them. Once the vaccine had been proven effective in those children, Jonas Salk started to conduct the largest field trial in medical history, starting with his own family. 2 years later, in 1955, the results of that trial were released, and it was a success. While Jonas Salk had faith in his inactive virus vaccine and its functionality, Albert Sabin did not, and believed that only the live virus vaccine would work. But while the live virus was in the field test, it had marginally higher infection because of vaccine than the dead virus, while it proved just as effective as each other. While the Salk vaccine was released and in use 2 years before, the Sabin vaccine was in testing. So the early conquest of polio was Salk's own creation. Sabin and the scientific community rejected Salk's work because they felt that Salk was a fame-seeking young star. But reality, he was a very humble humanitarian who not only wanted to help the world, he did so when he didn't patent the vaccine, making it easier and more affordable to produce.
Neither one of those reasons. I think what he was wanting to do was 2 things. First, there was a significant problem with polio. A lot of people were suffering, there was a tremendous amount of fear, and a vaccine was absolutely necessary. So his desire was to be able to address that problem as quickly and as effectively as possible. So that was the primary thing that was driving him.
Yeah.
The second thing that was driving him was that when he was in medical school, he had a professor who said in one class that it was possible to inactivate some chemicals that would allow you to make vaccines against a couple of different bacterial diseases. But then in the following class, he said that you can't do that with viral diseases. In order to create a protective immune response against a virus, you need to have a live virus. My father just didn't understand why that should be the case.
Yeah.
So that was the second thing that was driving him.
The immediate impact of the inactive polio vaccine was that in the beginning, it dramatically reduced the cases of polio each year. Salk's polio vaccine came out 6 years before Albert Sabin's oral vaccine. Salk's vaccine, while dramatically decreasing the amount of polio each year, he started to look outside of the U.S. to the other countries that were not as fortunate or would have not have had the vaccine until a couple more years. He even then shared it with sworn enemies of the Cold War, the Soviet Union. During his look to eradicate polio around the world, polio was eradicating in the U.S. in 1979. This vaccine not only started to save lives, but was uniting sworn enemies during one of the world's longest wars in history. It is still affecting the world in an effort to eradicate the polio virus worldwide. The inactive polio vaccine has become the #1 vaccine in first world countries. The polio and the creation of the inactive virus vaccine led to the creation of other vaccines such as hepatitis A and hepatitis B and rabies. These are both vaccines that were created since Salk's invention of the inactive virus vaccine.
At the height of the 1950s polio outbreak, Jonas Salk created a legendary vaccine. This vaccine would change the world in the way we make vaccines. We are still using this legendary vaccine in today's practical world. This vaccine was made by a selfless man who made a vaccine that would not only be life-saving, but did not break the bank. This is a vaccine that would revolutionize the way we make vaccines. Jonas Salk explored the realm of the inactive viral vaccine, even though he encountered criticism for the scientific community for his work, his motives, and for daring to make his dream a reality. While he exchanged the ideas with the only scientist who thought the way he was doing it the right way, his mentor, Dr. Francis Jr.